Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I'm your course instructor, Dr. Mazullah Khan. Uh, Today we will cover the last topic. Actually, we will complete our last topic of the course, which is environmental impact assessment. So let's proceed. Okay. So if you remember, in my last lecture, we covered the first 4 bullets. And today we will mostly talk about how do we perform the environmental impact assessment. Okay. So environmental impact assessment, it's a study to predict, okay, the effect of a proposed activity or project on the environment. And the reason we use the word predict, because we are doing environmental impact assessment studies for proposed projects. Okay, so the projects which will happen actually in the future. So environmental impact assessment, it's a study to predict the effect of proposed activity or project on the environment. It's a decision-making tool as well, okay? And it's a decision-making tool because it compares various alternatives, okay, for the project, and it identifies an alternative which represents the best combination of economic and environmental cost and benefits. As I told you in my last lecture, that every project has some negative externalities. Environmental impact assessment, the whole exercise is actually to minimize those negative externalities. What environmental impact assessment does, it compares various alternatives, and based on your evaluation, you pick the right alternative. And from right alternative, what I mean is the alternative which is the best combination of economic and environmental cost and benefits. Now, EIA applies to the assessment of environmental effects, okay, of those public and private sector projects which are likely to have a significant effects on the environment, okay. So the purpose of this bullet point is that in countries like Pakistan, environmental impact assessment are not done for each and every project, okay. They are done only for those projects which may have a significant effects on the environment. And as you will see from the last part of this lecture, that there are some projects, okay, in certain sectors, of course, they need, actually all of them, they need environmental impact assessment. So not every project needs environmental impact assessment, but environmental impact assessment studies are normally done for those projects which have a significant effects on the environment. Now, project can be any construction project, so execution of construction works, or any other installations, okay? So projects normally entails construction work or installations, okay? Other interventions in the natural surroundings or landscape, including those involving the extraction of minerals, okay? So besides construction works and installation, extraction of minerals in some areas, it is kind of an intervention, okay? So you are trying to actually, what's this called? Modify the ecosystem of a certain area, okay, by extracting the minerals. So impact evaluations, environmental impact assessments are also done for those projects which involves extraction of minerals, okay. The environmental effects, okay, so what we need to know is actually the nature of the environmental effect, okay. So for example, is the negative externality in terms of CO2 emission, or is it, let's say, in the form of industrial waste or chemicals, okay. Environmental effects also means like the size of the problem and the location, okay. So it's nature, size, and location. Direct and indirect effects of the project on the following factors, okay. So there may be some direct and indirect effects, okay, on human beings, fauna and flora, which is like the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, soil, water, air, climate, and the landscape, okay, and interaction of all these factors, okay, and it also involves material assets and the cultural heritage. So, for example, in countries, for example, in Canada, there are some indigenous communities. So whenever a government tries to start a project in those indigenous communities, they conduct the environmental impact assessment in which one of the main component is actually not to disturb the cultural heritage of those areas. Okay, so it is an important part of environmental impact assessment. Okay, so in Pakistan, initial environment examination is required if to check if a particular project need an environmental impact assessment. Okay, so those projects are included in Schedule 1. Okay, everything included in Schedule 2, they need environmental impact assessment. For Schedule 1, what you do, you conduct an initial environment examination, okay, and based on the finding of this initial environment examination, if it warrants further assessment of the impact, you conduct a complete environmental impact assessment, okay. But let's say if this initial environment examination suggests that the full-scale environmental impact assessment study is not required, then of course you do not carry out that study, okay. So in Schedule 1 projects, initial environmental examination is done, okay, and based on the finding of that report, you either conduct the EIA or you just ignore it, okay. So it really depends on the recommendations of the initial environment examination report. Schedule 2 projects, though, each and every project requires environmental impact assessment. Now, list of the projects which requires environmental impact assessment: agriculture, livestock and fishing, energy, manufacturing and processing, mining and mineral processing, transport, water management, dams, irrigation and flood protection, water supply and treatment, okay, water disposal, okay, urban development and tourism, okay. All these projects need environmental impact assessment. In countries like Pakistan, sometimes what really happens that some foreign international donors are involved in these projects. So they are actually providing funding for these projects. For example, World Bank or Asian Development Bank. So one of the requirements of those not donor actually, they give us loans, of those lending institutions, one of the requirement is that we have to conduct environmental impact assessment, okay. Sometimes it is also the requirement of EIA is also coming from the either donor or the lender. Now these are the key steps in environmental impact study assessment, okay. So everything starts with proposal identification, okay. So let's say if a government, whether municipal government, provincial and federal government, if they would like to start a project, okay, normally it starts with the proposal stage, okay. That proposal is screened, in other words, it is evaluated, okay. And if the EIA is required, okay, so you start here, okay. But some of the project, as I told you on one of my slides, okay, if the project is in Schedule 1, okay, it does not necessarily require EIA, okay. So you conduct initial environmental examination. If based on initial environmental examination, if no EIA is required, okay, that's fine, you just stop here. But let's say if the IEE, which is the initial environmental examination, if it suggests that it needs EIA. Okay, so you start this process here. Okay, so whenever we establish that the environmental impact assessment is required, the next stage is scoping. Okay, and I'll talk about what scoping actually entails. Then in the next step, we do impact analysis. Okay, and in the impact analysis, we also include mitigation and impact management. Okay, all these components actually form the EIA report. Okay, the next stage would be review. So a regulator or the public actually reviews the report, okay, and then make a decision. Okay, so the decision can be either approved, which is here, or not approved. Okay, if it is not approved, okay, you cycle back, you redesign the project and resubmit it for evaluation. Okay, but let's say if the decision is that the project is approved, then of course you go to implementation stage and post EIA monitoring. Okay, now the involvement of public, as I was talking in my last lecture, it is extremely important. Okay, it really helps public not okay, let me choose my words properly. So it creates actually ownership among the public for the project. Okay, and the people think that, okay, whatever the project is being carried out, the government or let's say the private company, they are really valuing their feedback. So the public involvement or feedback can be either involved in the scoping stage or in the review stage. But there is no rule of thumb. You can actually involve public's opinion in the scoping stage as well as in the review or in one of these. Okay, so there is no rule of thumb. Okay, so let's talk about scoping. Initial actually environmental examination. So the screening process results in the production of environmental screening summary note. Okay, so forget about these jargons. Okay, the most important thing is that the initial environmental examination, it includes brief project description, so it describes the project. Okay, environmental issues apparent at the screening. Okay, so they highlight the environmental issues, okay, involved in this project, significance of environmental impacts, risks, and or benefits. Okay, so the significance of environmental impact, risk, and benefits are also highlighted in this report. Okay, and the environmental investigation is proposed. If it is proposed, it means that we have to go to environmental impact assessment. Okay, it also, let's say, any other issues can also be highlighted, and then of course it highlights the actions which needs to be taken. One of the actions may be that it actually recommends either the regulator, the government, or the lender to carry out a full-scale environmental impact assessment study. So as I told you in one of my slides, that the initial environment examination is done on Schedule 1 projects in Pakistan. Okay, and if it recommends, okay, then we do environmental impact assessment. Okay, the full-scale one. Now scoping. Scoping, and I'll read through it because these are very, very easy to understand. Okay, so the objectives of the scoping are to enhance the environmental benefits. Okay, so that's one of the main purpose. To ensure compliance with relevant local legislation. Okay, to consider the alternatives to the proposed that should be examined. Okay, so consider the alternatives to the proposal that should be examined. Like for example, if the proposal in Pakistan is to, for example, build a railway track, okay, so we can connect different cities, okay, so we can choose different routes for it, okay. So the scoping of the environmental impact assessment study, it also touch upon the alternatives to the proposal. That okay, we are evaluating this proposal in terms of impact on on the environment, but there are some other alternatives. Okay, so scoping may also consider alternatives to the proposal to identify any significant adverse environmental effects and identify action. Okay, so this is the mitigation part. Okay, so scoping identifies, okay, the adverse environmental effects, but it also identifies the corrective actions. Okay, to provide for public consultation and input to the identification of issues to be examined. Okay, so scoping actually provides an opportunity for the public to provide their input, to define the data needs and field survey activities. Scoping actually defines the data needs. Okay, so for example, what would be the impact of the proposed project? Okay, in order to quantify that impact, you need data. Okay, so scoping actually defines the data. Okay, to determine the predictive techniques, and it also tells you about the techniques that the study is using for predictive analytics. Process of scoping. Okay, so prepare a scope outline. Okay, develop the outline through informal consultation with environmental and health authorities. Okay, you make the outline available. Okay, you make the outline available to the public because it is extremely important that you get their feedback, not only from the public but also from other agencies, okay, or companies. Compile an extensive list of concerns. Okay, so this is like a brainstorming stage where you compile extensive list of concerns. You evaluate relevant concerns to establish key issues. Okay, so this is like more of a brainstorming step. Okay, the evaluation part is more of an analytical step where we analyze all the concerns and then we identify the key issues. Organize key issues into impact categories. Okay, amend the outline accordingly. Okay, and develop terms of reference. Okay, for the impact analysis, and then you monitor the progress. Okay, so terms of reference is extremely important. Okay, so based on the feedback that you receive from the public and other agencies, okay, we identify key issues. Okay, we organize them, and we then develop terms of reference. Okay, so the terms of reference actually defines the scope of the project. Okay, of course you have to limit the scope of your project, so terms of reference is really about actually defining the scope of that project. Now the scope outcomes. What does the scoping does? So scoping identifies key issues and impacts to be considered. Okay, so it actually identifies key issues and impacts. Okay, it lays down the foundation of an effective process, saves time and money, and reduces conflict. Okay, because once you identify issues, once you identify the potential impacts of those issues, okay, and once you suggest corrective actions, it reduces the chances of any conflict. Now, impact analysis. Now, impact analysis, okay, whether the impact is biophysical, social, or is the impact, let's say, in terms of health or economic loss or economic gain. Okay, and what is the nature of impact? Is it direct or indirect or cumulative? Okay, so sometimes you cannot see the direct impact of a certain project, okay, but it has some indirect implications. Okay, especially in the biophysical space. Okay, because these projects has some long-term impacts. Okay, and it can certainly, for example, endanger some species. Let's say, for example, if we are talking about large projects like dams, okay, or even highways, okay, so it may have a direct or indirect implications on the different habitat or biophysical space. Okay, and what is the magnitude of that impact? So based on their experience, actually they uh, categorize them as high, low, or moderate. Okay, extent. Okay, so is the impact, okay, are the implications local, regional, or transboundary? So I was talking to you about a gas pipeline between US and Canada. Now that particular project has transboundary, okay, implications. Okay, so the implications are not limited to one country. Okay, and it may have some global implications as well. Timing. So is the impact itself, is the negative or the positive effects realizable immediately, or will these impacts be in the long term? Okay, and are these, like, let's say, temporary or permanent? Okay, and so uncertainty. Okay, for example, a certain let's say negative impact, for example, how likely is that? Okay, what is the likelihood of that? So for example, if I think we had a big issue, in my opinion, that was in Japan, because as a result of earthquake, one of their nuclear plants actually had developed some serious problems. Okay, so although those nuclear plants, I'm sure they must have done their environmental impact study, and the chances of whatever happened as a result of that earthquake, it might have been a low likelihood event. Okay, but things happen. Okay, so once you identify something in the environmental impact assessment, okay, you also assign the probability to it, whether it's a low likelihood event or is it a high probability event. Okay, reversibility. Are the negative effects, let's say, reversible, or they are irreversible in nature? Okay, because these will have different implications. Okay, significance. Are they significant? Okay, so from significant means, are these events, let's say, important or less important? Okay, now checklist, matrix, okay, geographical information system, expert systems, and professional judgment are used as a tool for impact identification. Okay, so we use all these three tools, including professional judgment, okay, for impact identification. Now, mitigation and impact management. Now, framework for impact mitigation, avoidance. Okay, so alternative sites or technology to eliminate habitat loss. So as I was talking to, let's say, if a government, whether provincial or federal government, if they would like to, let's say, build a dam, okay, and the environmental impact assessment study suggests that the impact will be huge in terms of, let's say, habitat loss. Okay, so your next question is, can we avoid this particular project? Okay, you just let's say change the site of your project, or you do some modifications. So you try to find out whether alternative sites or technology is available to eliminate the habitat loss. Okay, is the loss avoidable in that way, in other words? Okay, now actions during design, construction, and operation to minimize or eliminate habitat loss. Okay, so yes, you identify habitat loss, okay, you acknowledge it, but now you try to uh, provide some mitigation strategies. Okay, so avoidance is not an option, you are trying to mitigate it now. Okay, in other words, you are trying to minimize its impact. Okay, compensation. Okay, what really does, it's used as a last resort to offset the habitat loss. Okay, so you provide compensation. So for example, in social sphere, if a dam is resulting in, let's say, loss to somebody's property, for example, let's say it's a physical property, house or anything, okay, what you do, you provide compensation to them, okay. Now, moving actually from down to up, okay, this is a more desirable area, okay. Anything which can be avoided, of course, it is more desirable, okay. But things which cannot be avoided, then you provide compensation for them, okay, and it's a less desirable situation, okay. Okay, the EIA report. Now, the EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment Report, normally it entails the description of the project, so the project is described, an outline of the main alternatives, okay, so what are alternatives available to this project, okay, so an outline of the main alternatives studied by the developer, and an indication of the main reasons for this choice, okay. So it also highlights the areas where the main alternatives are described, okay, and then it also highlights those areas, the main reasons actually, that why this particular choice has been chosen, this particular alternative has been chosen, okay. A description of the likely significant environmental effects of the proposed project, okay. So you identify and recognize, okay, the significant environmental effects, okay. In fact, this is the main point of the EIA report, okay. You measure to prevent, reduce, and possibly offset the adverse environmental effect, okay. So either you try to prevent, okay, in that case it will be like avoidance, reduction would be mitigation, and possibly offset the adverse environmental effects. This would be the compensation part of it, okay. A non-technical summary, then of course you, since one of the main reasons you are writing the environmental impact assessment report is actually to share it with regulators and public, so you also write a non-technical summary, okay, which is like for consumption of general public. An indication of any difficulties, technical deficiencies, or lack of know-how encountered while compiling the required information, okay. So let's say if as a consultant, if you face any problem which may be in the form of technical deficiency or know-how, okay, you acknowledge that, okay, and you say that, okay, although I have this information, but I cannot comment on this one, okay. So rather than ignoring it, okay, you acknowledge it, you acknowledge your lack of know-how, you acknowledge your lack of technical deficiency, okay, and then you move on. Okay, so the last part of the of this actually flow chart is actually review, decision making, okay, and then of course if the decision is not to approve, you cycle back, you redesign the project and resubmit it, okay, for review. I'll stop here. Today's topic was not that difficult. It was very intuitive. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Please contact me at my email at mazullah@gk.edu.pk. I thank you very much for your attention and have a wonderful time.